But we begin tonight with a deep dive into what Donald Trump and his sycophants have planned for the Department of Justice under Project 2025 and how they would use the DOJ to attack American citizens. The 28-page section of the project's manifesto covering the Department of Justice and the FBI is a nightmarish play-by-play on how to turn the DOJ into the Office of Vengeance. But first, you should understand who's behind this horror show. This section was written by someone named Gene Hamilton, who is one of the roughly 30 former senior Trump administration officials who authored Project 2025. Hamilton is currently the legal director of America First Legal, the legal wing of the MAGA movement run by Heron-a-Can aficionado and former Trump senior advisor Stephen Miller, the guy behind migrant family separation and the Muslim ban. According to Hamilton and the folks at the Heritage Foundation, the Department of Justice would no longer be independent in a second Trump administration. On page 559, Hamilton writes, while the supervision of litigation is a DOJ responsibility, the department falls under the direct supervision and control of the President of the United States as a component of the executive branch. Thus, and putting aside criminal prosecutions that can warrant different treatment, litigation decisions must be made consistent with the president's agenda. So just to be clear, a man who was found liable for sexual abuse, a man who tried to steal the 2020 election through a violent coup, a man who stole classified documents and shared our secrets to random supporters, a man who has repeatedly extolled the virtues of vengeance, would now direct litigation priorities at the Department of Justice. Now, let's say a bunch of future DOJ officials chose to object to a President Trump ordering the assassination of a political opponent and threaten a mass resignation. Well, Project 2025 has a plan for that, too. They say, quote, the department's leadership is prepared to impose appropriate disciplinary action as circumstances arise. Those are the big ticket items, but there are the other very specific things they have in store for us all. Like deciding what investigations the FBI can conduct, how to use federal laws to prosecute state and local crimes, superseding state officials, recommending initiating legal action against local district attorneys who disagree with Trump's criminalization policies, vigorously restricting voting access, ending consent decrees, enforcing the national abortion ban that's already on the books, and ending affirmative action discrimination, which is a cute way of demonizing civil rights. And guess what? The FBI will become Trump's own personalized armed enforcement service. According to Project 2025, the FBI is not independent and does not deserve to be treated as if it were. Now, you might doubt that they really want to do this, or that even if they do it, that you'll be safe. Well, that is where you are entirely wrong. Trump already tried to prosecute Hillary Clinton, the Clinton Foundation, and James Comey, but his previous White House counsel advised against it, and Department of Justice career officials failed to find a crime. And let's not forget, his DOJ literally locked up Michael Cohen for cooperating in the investigation of Trump and writing a book that he didn't like. Imagine what they could do with a department full of people who have literally chanted, "Lock her up." There would be targets on the backs of people like Congresswoman Liz Cheney, Congressman Benny Thompson, and any other member of the January 6th committee. Just this morning, Trump accused Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi of failing to do her job in protecting the Capitol from his supporters on January 6th. He said it was criminal. Yesterday, in a lie-filled screed, Trump called for the prosecution of, quote, election fraudsters, including Mark Zuckerberg, stating that they will be sent to prison for long periods of time. And what does that mean for you? Well, you won't have access to abortion. Police will have free rein to beat up and even kill people without consequences. You could be prosecuted for minor drug possession, and they'll be enforcing the death penalty aggressively. Godspeed if you're a migrant, because they have detailed plans for you, which include national raids and prison camps. Joining me now is Melissa Murray, NYU law professor, MSNBC legal analyst, and co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, and Ruth Ben-Ghiat, New York University professor of history and author of Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present. Thank you both for being here. Melissa, anything I missed in there and anything else we should be concerned about for the average American with that kind of DOJ?
That was a really comprehensive list, and it really does cover most of the 900 pages of Project 2025, which is essentially the authoritarian's playbook. One point that I do want to mention here, though, is that the Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity, which was announced just a week ago, has really given a major assist to Project 2025. One of the things that that decision made very clear is that when the president is communicating with the DOJ or issuing orders through the DOJ, because the DOJ is viewed as an extension of the executive, of the president, those actions are immunized. Project 2025 ramps this up, puts it on steroids, makes it impossible, essentially, to prosecute the president or indeed anyone working through the DOJ for those acts because they are official acts within the perimeter of those official duties. It takes the unitary executive theory and really amps it up and makes the president essentially a king. So the court has laid a foundation to make Project 2025 not just palpable, but indeed something that will last and be lasting throughout our history of Donald Trump as president.
And Ruth, then how would we be any different from, say, Russia or China or any other authoritarian country?
Not much, and that the very definition of authoritarianism is when the executive branch overwhelms or politicizes or hinders from being independent, the judiciary, the other branches of government. And so but what's interesting is all the parts of Project 2025 work together because you also have to have a compliant civil service because, fascists and authoritarians, they have to destroy to create. So they're going to take apart the DOJ as an independent body and make it into something else. That something is a body that will protect the president and his cronies from investigations, from prosecution. But it's not enough for the president to have immunity. You have to have a compliant civil service. So there we have the presidential, the training academy that's going to create what they call an army. They use that word of vetted conservatives to go to work on day one. And so all of these things have to come together. And when you have a politicized civil service, and in the Nazi context, Hannah Arendt called these people the desk killers, the people who signed the orders to harass and repress people. And of course, later, in the German context, to do the Holocaust. But all these things must come into play. And the last thing that you must do is turn the public against the press, against journalists, so that any claims they make about prosecution, things that might be worthy of prosecution, are no longer believed by the public. And Donald Trump has already been able to do that.
Yeah, and then maybe just start arresting members of the press. Let me play something that is, in a way, sort of funny and absurd, but actually deadly serious in another way. This is Stephen Miller's America First Legal organization. This is one of their advertisements.
I am here today with an urgent message. America's biggest corporations and universities are illegally discriminating against Americans based on race and sex. These corporations and universities have adopted so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that punish Americans for being white, Asian, or male. If you or a loved one were denied a job, raise, promotion, or professional opportunity as a result of diversity quotas, equity mandates, affirmative action, or other racial preferences, we want to hear from you.
Melissa, it's sort of one part ambulance chaser ad and one part NAAWP Legal Defense Fund, right? But what he's doing there is what the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department would change it to, right? A place where the whole mission would be to defend white privilege.
No, that's exactly right, Joy. I mean, obviously, enforcement priorities shift from administration to administration. And we've seen, for example, under Republican administrations, there's been less enforcement of voting rights, for example, or less prosecution of voting rights claims. But Project 2025 explicitly says that the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education will be dedicated to dealing with what they call reverse discrimination. So DEI measures in corporate America and in public institutions and in universities and colleges. Basically, the real racism to be fought is the racism and the racial injuries that are endured by white men, principally, and those who are outside of what they view as the affirmative action spectrum.
Yeah, and let's go on to the sort of apologists for this. People who are sort of trying, Ruth, to make this sound like it's not that big of a deal. So Bloomberg is reporting that the CEO of Warner Brothers, David Zaslav, has said regarding the presidential election, asked about the upcoming presidential election, he said it mattered less to him which party wins as long as the next president was friendly to business. We just need an opportunity for deregulation, he said, so companies can consolidate and do what we need to do better. So, of course, they want lots of deregulation, meaning they'd probably be fine with having Trump. But I just want to remind Mr. Zaslav and others the way that this works in a country like Russia, because you said we'd be no different from that. The Kremlin has said that Vladimir Kara-Murza is, quote, stable in a Russian prison hospital, but we're not even sure that that's true. A Russian playwright and theater director was sentenced to prison for writing a play that Putin didn't like. And Russia has issued an arrest warrant for Yulia Navalny, who is the widow of Alexei Navalny, who they killed or allowed to die in a gulag. That's how it goes, right? If suddenly they don't like, Donald Trump doesn't like what David Zaslav has on his networks, he goes from being somebody who gets juicy deregulation and tax cuts to somebody who's kind of living like the Navalnys.
Yeah, but it's way beyond that because he could say, well, I'm not a dissident. But Putin's state is a kleptocracy, as to various degrees. Most authoritarian states are, they thrive on corruption. And by 2018, 1 out of 6 of every 6 Russian business person, if their business was like prospering, the state would come after it to either seize its assets or make money because they would, find some they would fabricate some tax charge, crime, and so they prey on businesses. And it's the same in Erdogan's Turkey, where the state has plundered and seized assets worth over $40 billion since the 2016 coup attempt. And so authoritarianism is not good for business.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.